Bias. Bias is either intended or unintended, and it's an influence on the data gathering method. So when you bias something, it means that the results you get are not actually accurate. Something happened to those results. Now, maybe you intended for that to happen, or you made a mistake and unintentionally made errors in gathering your data. But either way, it creates this thing called bias. It can be any factor that favors certain outcomes or responses, which skews, we've seen that before, positively and negatively skews the survey results. Some ways bias could occur. You can copy these down since you have the note in front of you. Number one, if your sample size is too small, let's say less than 10% of the population, if that sample size is too small, you're probably not going to get a very good result from your survey. And why? Because most likely the people that you asked are not going to be representative of the entire population. They might be, but there's a good chance they won't be if you've picked too small sample size. The second way a bias could occur, if the sample that you chose was big enough, but it still does not reflect the entire population. You have to make sure that your sample is chosen randomly and not just from one specific section of the school or one specific grade. You have to make sure that when you're choosing your sample, you do so the least biased way possible. So it has to reflect the entire population. The third way is perhaps the way that the questions on your survey are worded. Maybe you're leading them to an answer, and that would definitely bias the results or change the results. They wouldn't be honest results, at least. And the fourth way, the sampling technique that you chose does not give accurate answers. So it all depends on what you've chosen as your sampling technique as well. You have to be very careful about that. It's important to understand not only how to use stats, but also to recognize when others try to either intentionally or unintentionally mislead us or misuse statistics. People like to mislead us, especially the news. They love putting up graphs that when you really look at them carefully, you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. So we have to be very careful about that, how people use statistics for their own purposes and whether that stat actually is meaningful or not. Here are the different types of bias that we're going to talk about in this lesson. Sampling bias, it results from problems with either the sampling technique that you chose or the data collection method itself. The sample could be too small or it could not accurately reflect the population. So that's anything that when that occurs, what you get is called sampling bias. Non-response bias occurs when groups are underrepresented in a survey because they choose not to participate. And yes, it's a form of sampling bias, but really it's because they chose not to participate in the survey. And this is definitely related to voluntary response sampling because that's the one where you're handing out flyers and you're saying, please fill out my survey, but people are hungry for lunch heading into the cafeteria. So they're not going to fill out the survey. Or at least most of them aren't. Measurement bias occurs when the data collection method either consistently underestimates or consistently overestimates a characteristic of the population. Consistently is the important word here. Random errors tend to cancel each other out. I measured this person a little too tall. I measured this person a little too short, but they'll cancel each other out when we're calculating an average. A consistent measurement error, though, will skew the results of a survey, and we'll see that coming up. Response bias occurs when participants in a survey deliberately give false or misleading answers. They may want to influence the results, or they could be too afraid or embarrassed to answer questions honestly. If it's a sensitive topic, that makes sense. So response bias occurs when people give false or misleading answers. That could be deliberately, or it might not be. Household bias occurs when a researcher samples the same number of people from different groups, even though those groups are of different sizes. So in other words, they didn't use stratified sampling. Remember, in stratified sampling, each group has a representative proportion that's picked. So if they don't, if the researcher doesn't pick those proportions correctly, and they just pick the same size from each of the different groups, then what is created is called household bias. So what I want you to do is take all of these different types of bias, and I want you to think now for each of the situations given below. I want you to be able to identify the type of bias that might occur. What am I getting at here? And then suggest how it could be avoided. So there's always going to be two parts to these types of questions that I ask you. So I give you a scenario, like example 1, and we have to figure out the type of bias that might occur and how we could avoid it. So a survey asked students at a football game whether a fund for extracurricular activities should be used to buy new equipment for the football team or instruments for the school band. So let's start off with this question. If you want to pause the video here, you can think about it, maybe write your own ideas down, and then unpause to get the answer. Okay, we're back. So the type of bias that might occur at this one, well, if we're asking students at a football game whether extra money should be used to buy new equipment for the football team or something else, don't you think that those people are more likely to say, yeah, I think we should buy more equipment for the football team. Let's use it, all that money, extra money for the football team. And the reason is because you're asking people at the game who clearly like football. So the type of bias that I would say would occur here is sampling bias. Your sample does not reflect the population completely. You haven't chosen the right type of people, or you haven't chosen your sample correctly. What should your sample be? Well, maybe choose a different sampling method. This looks like a convenient sample to me. So choose a different sampling method, or ask people not at the football game, but maybe in the school cafeteria or in the library, where there's a wider variety of people, of students that you could ask. That might help avoid that bias. In example 2, we have a science class that asks every 5th student that enters the CAF to answer a survey on environmental issues. Less than half agree to complete the questionnaire. So they don't have a ton of questionnaires filled out. But the completed ones show that a high proportion of respondents are concerned about the environment and are well informed about the issues. Well, this is clearly non-response bias, and it's because a lot of students chose not to participate in this survey. So their voices are not being heard. The reason their voices are not being heard is because the way I know that is because the completed ones show a high proportion of respondents are concerned about the environment. Well, what do you think that high proportion is made up of? There's a lot of the people that actually did fill out the questionnaire that are concerned about the environment. This is an important thing to them. So they didn't stop, and they actually stopped and not kept going. Of course, they're well informed about the issues. They want to fill that survey out. So we got to be careful about that. How do we prevent that from happening? Or how do we avoid that bias? Don't make it optional. So hand it to every 5th student and say, you must fill this out. Or go class to class and ask teachers to ask their students to fill them out. And they have to fill them out. It can't be optional, basically. In example 3, we have a poll by a tabloid magazine that includes the question, do you favor the proposed bylaw in which the government will dictate whether you have the right to smoke in a restaurant. Now, this is a trickier one. It's not sampling bias because it's a poll by a tabloid magazine. Now, you'd think, probably, I would think, you'd think that if it's a tabloid magazine, only specific people are reading that magazine, and that's partially true. But we have to assume that all different types of people are reading this magazine. So that's not really the issue here. The issue here is how the question is asked. It's all in the way the question's asked. So here, do you favor the proposed bylaw in which the government will dictate? That's a very strong word, dictating. What's this government dictating to me now? Whether you have the right to smoke in a restaurant. Wait a minute. So the government is dictating whether I have the right. They're going to take away one of my rights? Oh, that's not good. So the way this question is worded, it doesn't even matter if it's a good or bad thing. They're trying to lead you to an answer. They're trying to get you to answer a certain way. And maybe most of us would think, yeah, well, actually, that's a good thing. I don't want smoke in a restaurant. The bylaw is trying to get rid of smoking in restaurants. And that's a good thing, technically. So why is this such a poorly worded question then? Because people would get their backs up when the government starts taking their rights away and dictating to them what is good and bad for them. A normal, logical person might actually answer to this if they're in a bad mood. They might say, no, I don't favor that bylaw. I don't want my rights being taken away, and I don't like being dictated to. So because of those words, they're trying to lead those people to a certain answer. And what the bias here is created is called measurement bias. Measurement bias is going to, in this case, underestimate the number of people that are actually in favor of this proposed bylaw. Because some people will read this and say, I don't want my rights taken away, so they'll vote no. When really, the question should say, do you favor the proposed bylaw to stop smoking in a restaurant or to not allow smoking in restaurants? That's all it should say. And then that's a very simple way to ask it so that people say, yeah, I do favor that. I don't want smoking in restaurants. Or maybe they don't, but at least it won't lead them to an answer. How do I avoid it? Get rid of all these excess words that are strongly worded and just say that simply, right? Do you favor the bylaw to stop, to not allow smoking in restaurants, period? Example 4, an aid agency in a developing country wants to know what proportion of households have at least one personal computer. So, one of the staff members conducts a survey by calling randomly selected households selected from the phone directory. Well, what type of bias would occur here? Yeah, the problem here is because they're phoning people, calling them up and saying, hello, hi, do you have a personal computer at home? Well, the problem with that is if they have a phone, which means they have electricity, they're more likely to have a personal computer. They may not, but they're more likely to. If they don't have a phone, there's probably zero chance they also have a personal computer. So, what type of sampling is this? I would think this is sampling bias. What kind of bias is sampling bias? And sampling bias because we're not getting a good cross-section of the population here. How do I change it? How do I avoid it? Definitely don't be phoning people from the phone book, and especially not randomly selected households. I'd go out on foot and go door to door and start knocking on doors and asking them directly, do you have a personal computer? And make sure, even if you want to choose randomly selected households, you're going to go knock on their door instead of calling them up. Example 5, a highway engineer suggests the best way to survey traffic speeds would be to have police officers who regularly patrol that highway record the speed of traffic around them every half hour. Well, this is measurement bias again, because we all know what happens when we see a police officer around us. We slow down. And so that's not going to be a very good way, especially if they have their radar gun out. People are definitely going to slow down. So it's not going to be a very good way to survey traffic speeds or to get accurate traffic speeds. What will happen is, if we do this, we'll be gathering speeds that are definitely underestimating the true speed of the highway. Or traffic on the highway. So that means, to avoid it, we can't have police officers doing this. We have to have unmarked cars doing it. It could still be police officers, but it can't say police on the car. It has to be unmarked, or someone hiding on the side of the road with a radar gun taking the speeds, or a robot doing it, automated. So the people driving on the highway cannot be aware that their speed is being taken. That's the important part, so that we get a true representation of the speed of traffic. And finally, example 6, after this lesson, I want to check that everyone understood and grasped the new concept clearly. I asked students to put up their hand if they didn't get it. So put your hand up if you didn't get it. No one puts up their hand, even though it was a very complex and difficult lesson. Well, not this one, but what's the reason why people aren't putting their hand up? Well, they're too embarrassed to admit they didn't get it. So obviously I did not run my survey properly. Has nothing to do with the sample. The sample is really the students in front of me, and that's exactly right, which is really the population technically. So it has nothing to do with sampling bias. This, because people didn't put their hand up and were embarrassed to, is called response bias. And how do I stop this response bias from happening? Because I really do want to know if you get it or not. Just the way I asked this question is terrible. So I could say, all right, everybody put a hand up with fingers from 1 to 5. 1 meaning I'm not sure how to do this yet. 5, I could do it in my sleep. Put it in front of your chest, and everyone close your eyes and do that now, so no one else can see how many fingers you're putting up. So it's a little more anonymous. I could do it that way. Or I could just suggest, if you had trouble with the lesson, come and see me after class or during lunch, and I can give you some help. That's fine too. But I still want to be able to check, like a spot check. So I think the spot check would be more like the fingers on the chest kind of thing. Would be a good idea for that. Or people could write a number on a piece of paper and submit that in a hat or something, and then with their name and the number, and I could pull out the ones that are a 1 and speak to those students later on. Okay, that ends this lesson, guys. I'll stop there, and I will get on to the next one, which is 1.5, data analysis with graph.